An individual commits the fallacy of accident when they reason as follows. First, they state some general rule, or they make a general claim. But this rule or general utterance has some exceptions to it. But then what they do is they reason to the conclusion that the rule actually applies to those cases that are excluded by the implicit qualifications of the rule. That is, they treat the rule as though it applies to those exceptions. Let me start with an extreme example of this. Let's say someone reasons as follows: you shouldn't cut other people. But then they say, well, if you shouldn't cut other people, then surgeons, when they're performing surgery, shouldn't cut other people. Now, this rule is fallacious because we think that the original utterance, the original premise, has certain qualifications or exceptions to it. We think in general you shouldn't cut other people, but there are some qualifications that are just unstated. That is, surgeons should be allowed to cut other people when they're performing surgery, or maybe you're allowed to cut another individual if they break into your home and you're trying to save yourself or someone else. Let me give you a less extreme example. Take the golden rule. A lot of people think that everyone should follow the golden rule. This is the rule that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then someone might reason, well, therefore a masochist should harm other individuals as the masochist wants others to inflict pain on him or herself. Again, we think that there are some implicit exceptions to the golden rule, that it doesn't apply to masochists or psychopaths or individuals who maybe want the world to end. The most straightforward example of the fallacy of accident is simply when an individual reasons that a rule applies to cases that are really excluded by some unstated qualifications or implicit restrictions on that rule. But there's a more subtle use of the fallacy of accident. This occurs when an individual will apply the rule to its exceptions in order to refute the rule. Let's look at an example of this. Someone might try to disprove the golden rule by reasoning as follows. They'd say, well, everyone should follow the golden rule, or that's what at least people say. But if that's the case, then this would apply to masochists, and then these masochists should actually harm other individuals because they themselves want to be harmed. But intuitively, we think masochists should not harm other individuals. We reject this consequence. We think this is false. And so what they would ultimately conclude is that the golden rule must be false. Since it leads us to this crazy consequence, there must be something mistaken about the rule itself. Here's a maybe simpler example. Sometimes people will say birds can fly. Well, then if someone wants to refute this, they would say, well, if birds can fly, then penguins, which are birds, and birds with broken wings, and baby birds, all of these things can fly. But many birds, as we know, cannot fly. And so the rule or the general statement that birds can fly is false. Here we've committed the fallacy of accident again, because when someone says birds can fly, they have in mind some exceptions to this rule. They say these are the things that cannot, at least currently, fly right now. And so when they say birds can fly, they're not including these cases. Here's a more practical example. So there were some guidelines about mask wearing, and one guideline that came out was you are required to wear a mask at any indoor gathering. Well, some individuals who, let's say, didn't like this rule reasoned as follows. They say, well, this rule also applies to when I'm home with my family and not in a stranger's house. I'm at an indoor gathering with the people that I live with. So then they argue that this was too restrictive. The government shouldn't require you to have to wear a mask at home with the people that you live with. And so given that the rule seemed to imply this absurd consequence, they then turned around to refute the rule altogether. They say that this rule is unjust. It doesn't need to be followed. So again, this is an application of the fallacy of accident here. The rule you are required to wear a mask at any indoor gathering wasn't meant or intended to apply to when you're home with the family members that you live with. So the key feature to the fallacy of accident for me is that when an individual commits this fallacy, they're ignoring the exceptions to a rule, or they're ignoring the scope to which the rule applies, or they're ignoring the conditions under which a general statement has applicability. So one question we might consider is, why aren't people being explicit when they utter rules? When I say birds can fly, why am I ignoring all of the exceptions to the rule? And I want to give two reasons as to why people don't qualify these rules. The first reason is purely practical. One, it is time consuming to list out all of the exceptions to certain rules. And then two, we just assume people know what those exceptions are. So to go through and list all of those exceptions would be a kind of waste of their time as well as our own. So to illustrate, I might say birds can fly, but if I wanted to be more precise and waste your time, I would say
birds can fly except for penguins, dead birds, birds with broken wings, baby birds, some old birds, maybe overweight birds, maybe birds that are under sedation for experimental purposes, maybe birds with genetic defects, maybe birds that have had their wings impaired in some way, shape, or form.
This would take a long time to articulate all of the different exceptions to this rule that birds can fly. The second reason we don't make all of these implicit qualifications explicit is because we're working with the mutual assumption that these rules apply in normal circumstances. We're not thinking about the rule's applicability to every conceivable or hypothetical or unrealistic circumstance. Sometimes one individual will say to another, "I will always love you." The other individual who hears this might say, "Well, is this really the case? What about if I become an evil individual? What about if I lie or cheat? What about if I start hurting other individuals and become diabolical in nature?" If an individual says, "I will always love you," what they mean to say is that they will love that other individual given the normal course of events, not given any hypothetical or unrealistic or fantastical scenario, but just under the normal set of hardships. Here's one more example. Let's say I say that a knife will cut my flesh. But I might say, hey, this rule doesn't apply universally. There are some exceptions. The exception might be, what if my skin magically turns into a hard material such that it's impervious to cuts? Well, okay, yeah, that would be an exception. But when we say knives are dangerous or knives can cut the flesh, what we mean is under the normal, realistic, usual circumstances, this is the case.